Hello, everybody. I'm Jacob Gebrewold. I'm an account executive here at Klue, and welcome to Leading Sales to Competitive Victory. We're excited to get started. As you probably have heard in the group chat, we're going to get started a little sooner because there's there's a good emergency as to why we're starting sooner. We're going to be ending sooner. So make sure that if there are other people that you know are looking to get in on this session, maybe haven't heard yet, go ahead and give them a tap and say, hey, Kevin and Jake, getting started. In the meantime, looking forward to seeing where everybody is from. So if you want to hop into the event chat, you can go ahead and do that on the right-hand side. Would be great to just kind of hear where people are from as everybody's pouring in. Also, I think it's probably just good table setting, and I'm going to do this maybe a little bit over the next couple minutes. Just let everybody know who we're going to be having on. If you're not familiar with Kevin Dorsey, I remember one time I was doing a podcast with with KD, and I asked him, or I introduced him as, the man, the myth, the legend. And he came in and he was like, people keep calling me like a man, sure, myth, I don't know, legend, like I guess. But so he's pretty humble about it. He'll play it down, I'm sure. But if you haven't checked out any of his stuff, whether it's his Patreon, whether you're following him on LinkedIn, this is going to be a really great introduction for you to KD. If you already know KD, you already know what it is. But if not, I would highly recommend even just go and find him on LinkedIn now, hit that follow button, and get ready for a lot of really great content that we're going to have in this session. So without further ado, love to bring him on. Let's see how this goes. KD.
Oh yeah, here we go.
All black everything. How you doing?
Dude, I'm good, my man. I'm good. I feel like I'm always sprinting, even though I'm sitting down, but it's all good, baby. It's why we do what we do.
Totally. This is exciting to have you on. Obviously, VP of Inside Sales at PatientPop. There's so many hats that you wear. How do you typically introduce yourself? If you had to tee yourself up, what would you say?
So when people add, introducing myself, generally say, I'm Kevin Dorsey. Everyone calls me KD unless I'm in trouble, then the Kevin comes out. I tell them, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a salesperson, and I'm a sales leader, but in that order, and I think oftentimes we always identify ourselves with our job first, right? Like, oh, what do you do? I'm a VP of sales. Well, far before I'm a VP of sales, I'm a father to my kids, I'm a husband to my wife, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a person. And I think that's actually going to be a theme a little bit of our conversation, is remembering the person side of this. So that's who I am, my man. I'm passionate about this. I love sales. I love sales people, and hopefully I can provide some value today.
Yeah, I'm anticipating you are, and that's just because we've had so many conversations, you and I, where I always walk away with something to apply, and we've gotten to know KD a little bit. Y'all, you heard I'm an account executive here at Klue. I love how Jason teed it up yesterday, like, oh, Kevin and Jacob are going to say a bunch of great stuff. Now, I'm mostly going to be asking questions, but if I've got, a center to the lob in, happy to do it from the individual contributor perspective too. But what we'd love also to do is to get to know y'all. So if you're not familiar with the Hop-In platform, on the right-hand side, you'll see the ability to both have the event chat and the polls. On the poll side, you can hop in there and just go ahead and respond with, who are you? Like, what do you do from a job perspective? That's great. But also love to hear you hop in the event chat and tell us a little more about yourself, where you're from, what sorts of challenges y'all are facing. Would also love to hear, maybe your favorite sports team. Hopefully, I know Katie's is in Texas right now. Hopefully your favorite sports team is doing better than the Houston Rockets. That's all I'm going to say. But Katie, what's your favorite sports team actually, before we get into too much?
So, I'm LA, born and raised, baby. So obviously I rock my Dodgers cap. So I'm still a little bit sensitive over, the series with the Braves, Lakers fan. Then like my college is Wisconsin. And oh man, can we kick Emma out? We might have to kick Emma out of the session here. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
And then like Packers and Badgers. It's okay, Emma. I just disagree. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Vancouver guy, so I'm a Toronto Raptors guy up until it gets to literally any other sport, and then I want to see Toronto buried, but especially hockey wise. But yeah, it's great to see everybody popping in here. Go ahead and throw in the event chat, but also on the poll side of things. Would love to hear, what do you do? And then also I'm going to throw out here, just as we're getting into the conversation, KD, it has to get going at the top of the hour because of some very exciting news that we can't actually give you right now. But I would love to hear, KD, from, as we're getting into competitive selling, I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the biggest myths you hear people believe around competitive selling against competitors that makes them worse at it?
So if I think about the myths, right, like oftentimes people are told, this will sound weird, but you get what I'm saying. Like, don't bash your competitor is something that gets said often, right? Like you don't bash, right? But then what that also causes a lot of people to do is do nothing, right? Because they don't know what to do, right? So that's one of, like, you need to be ready to talk about the differences. The other big myth is people say, like, ask them, try to find out what they don't like about it. Asking people what they do like about something, and this is going to mess with y'all quite possibly for the rest of your lives. You're going to notice this when we talk to people, and it's going to throw you off. When you ask people the good about something, they almost always still share the bad about something, right? Yeah. So like as a myth, right, people like they try to dance around what's good or bad, whereas when you find out someone's using a competitor, you say, awesome, what do you love about it? I promise you, at a high clip, they'll tell you what they like, but they'll also say, like, it does take a while to upload, but besides that, like, we love it. So that's another myth of, like, not asking them to say good things about their competitor. And then here's the last myth, that competition's a bad thing. Okay, this is the biggest myth, that competition is a bad thing. If you are targeting an account that uses your competitor, it means they have already made the leap to solve the problem that you're trying to solve and spend money on it. Going after competition is actually a great thing because they've already opened up the doors on why they should make the change, why they should buy, why they should spend. So I think those are three of the bigger myths that I see around competition that makes people worse, because and salespeople, this, you hear they use a competitor and we flatten out. Like, it's like, oh, okay, well, when's the contract up for? No. Like, we should be like, oh, you thank God you use something. Let's talk about it, right? So that's where I would say the bigger myths come in.
Yeah, and I think there's this, tucked into what you're talking about, this idea that when the competition comes up, people are typically shutting down. And like, why do you think that sellers shut down most? Because like you said, I think it's probably really good news that someone concedes they've got a problem. So why do you think people are shutting down so much in these conversations?
Well, one, kind of that myth, right? Like, if you haven't been taught to think this way, you're not going to think this way. You think competition is bad. You hear competition and go, oh, this is going to be harder, versus leaning into it. And so I think that's the first, is that it's never been explained this way to a lot of people. But second, and let's be honest, most sales reps don't know their competition well. So when they hear there's a competitor, they don't actually know what to do in that situation, right? And that's where it gets troublesome. But another big part of this, though, too, and this is, I got to be careful with, I'm not trying to like hate on certain things, but a lot of the qualification processes that have been rolled out to SDRs and AEs, the BANTs, the medics, right? Well, if you're doing BANT and someone's using a competitor, it's automatically going to be declined on timeline, right? Because, they've already using something, need may not be met because they already have something and they haven't allocated budget for it. Yeah. So it's all of a sudden DQ'd because of the qualification process. So if I'm an SDR and I hear they're using a competitor, I already know they don't have budget allocated, right? But they actually do. And that's the best part. They do have budget allocated. They're already spending it. So it's easier to allocate it. But people don't think that way.
And I think this is something that's coming up, even as I'm looking at the polls of what people are wanting to hear you talk about most. The one that's blowing up most is discovery is differentiation. And you're, I see you already in your bag talking about where BANT can kind of, not lead the conversation where it needs to go to be providing relative value. Like, how do you do discovery as competitive differentiation?
So how do I use discovery as a competitive I can't say the word. How do I separate, like, how do I go against someone that's using a competitor, or just how do I do discovery different than my competition?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, feel free to talk about displacing someone who's already there, or if you're going into a new market, whichever direction you want to take first. But the context here being, like, we all know, right, in sales, discovery is where the real wins, begin and end, right? If you fail at doing that consistently throughout a process, in a way that helps a buyer understand their challenges, we're already, out of an ability to help them understand how we could support them. I've heard you talk a lot about this. Are there things you do in discovery that help set you apart in your competitive landscape, or how do you think about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so what we work on and teach internally, and I've preached a lot about, is problem-based discovery. First of all, there's a big difference between qualification and discovery. Big difference. If you are qualifying people, that's not discovery, right? That you're not actually finding anything out that moves the deal along. Right. So make sure those are separate. First of all, BANT is not discovery. BANT is just like a qualification. MEDDIC is a qualification. MEDDPICC is a qualification. Discovery is all about, can you help them realize that they are facing certain problems? And this is why it's so beautiful when you're dealing with someone who is using your competitor. If you are asking problem-based questions and they're using your competitor, you've already started to separate yourself, because they're still facing problems and they're using your competitor. So you're setting the groundwork there of, like, okay, like, let's talk about some of the problems a lot of VPs have. Are you facing these? Because here's the flip side. If they're using a competitor and they are not facing any problems that you solve, then there's nothing you could do there. Right? So these are things that you need to think through. But then here's the other side, is get them to tell you why they were trying to solve the problem in the first place. Right? So you said, oh, yeah, we already used somebody. Great. You know how many VPs I talk to that aren't doing anything right now? Okay, now you're leaning into their ego, congratulating them. Why did you decide to do something about it? What was this problem causing? Now you're bringing them back to problem-based language, right? And then here's the key with your competition. You need to have what we call them buster questions, right? Great. But how do you? If there's something you do differently in your product that makes you better than your competition, you're asking but how do you? Okay, so great, you do this. Okay, that's why you tried to solve the problem. That's the impact of it. Cool. But how do you automate it? But how do you log it and share it? But that's your differentiator question, right? You say, but how do you? And they go, well, I guess we really can't. That's where you need to know the differences between you and your competition. Most people only know what they do the same. Very few teams know what they do differently, and that's where they get stuck.
Yeah, I think that's especially helpful when you're going up against a competitor you're trying to displace, because they're living. You can't just sell the dream to someone, when you're talking to a person who's already using your product, right? If they're over promising and under delivering in the marketplace, the person who's going to know it most is their customers. So those questions are going to be especially poignant for them. What do you do in situations, though, where you're fighting for new business? They don't really have a lived reality of a vendor that maybe overpromised or under-delivered. How do you think about that with a new market or a new client?
So it's very similar, right? You take a problem-based approach, but then here's the key, is you prepare them to talk to your competition. You prepare them to talk to the competition, right? So if we're in a sales process, we cannot be ignorant to think they're only talking to us. That's where you get into trouble, is just because they didn't mention competition, we don't cover competition, right? So it's assuming that they will. You're preparing them for this, right? So Jacob, it sounds like you're really interested in trying to solve this problem, and there's a lot of options out there. If you're going to look at other options, be sure you ask them these 5 questions. Be sure you ask them these questions, because otherwise it's all going to sound the same. So you prepare them to ask some of the same gap questions and problem questions that you walk them through. This is the difference when it's a competitive market, is who's actually helping them buy. Who's helping them buy? Because if they haven't bought it before, they don't know how to buy it. So having that FAQ, having those questions of like, hey, all right, if you're going to go talk to someone, make sure you ask them these 2 questions, because sometimes you can miss out like what's actually going on behind the scenes. Now who's actually a trusted advisor? Now who's actually guiding them to get the end result? You are. I can promise you the competition's not doing that.
Yeah, and that stands out as one of the things I know top performers are consistently doing when we look at, content within Klue of what top performers are engaging with at our clients. One of the main cards that they engage with within Klue is questions to ask or landmine questions that they can put in a buyer's hands, so that way they really get the down and dirty when they're going to get talk to a competitor again. So I guess another question to build off of that, does that discovery process change? Are there different things you're thinking about when maybe you're second in rather than first? So they've already had some of that stuff planted by your competitor. Are there things that you're doing differently in that conversation with your second in the door?
It's actually it's very similar. You ask them how your competitor answered those questions, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay, so now one of the things we do is like, we have these automated cards that pop up based off what's happening. How did they show you the automation, or how did they show you these things, right? So it's still asking the but questions. And that is where you lean into it, right? And you go, all right, so you tell me why you're looking into this, right? What problem you're trying to solve? What are you running into right now? Because also too, by the way, asking problem-based discovery in itself is a competitive advantage, because most discovery sounds like what we were talking about before. Yeah. So how many employees do you have? And what are your goals this year? Okay, great. Versus I'm talking to VPs all day. They are really struggling with blank. Like, is that your world too? Talk to me about that a little bit. What problems are you facing? What is that causing? What would it mean for you if we solved those things? How have you tried to solve that in the past, right? When you act like that, and this is another big one too. So Oren Clough talked about this in his book, Flip the Script. He said having a status alignment question. So a status alignment question is a question that only someone on the same level as you can ask. Right. Yeah. So a lot of SDRs and AEs talk to me, right? They try to sell me and they'll say, so like, so what are your goals this year? Well, it's too broad. Versus if you come to me and say, yo, since going remote, a lot of VPs are noticing the cost of acquisition has gone up and ramp time is 2 to 3 times higher than it is before, causing them to miss plan. Are you seeing that? Whoa. Like, so now you're asking a question that only someone that gets me could ask. That also builds trust.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that when it comes to conversations you'd ask of people on your level, or that you'd ask to show that you're on the level of a senior executive and leader, I think one thing that a lot of sellers are trying to improve at is not being so like product feature, let me just show you my thing, but really trying to get into that strategic level conversation. Jordan, are you cool to come on screen to ask your question just yet, or should I just fire it off? Because I know we got limited time left with KD here. Oh, he's hopped in the room. Let's see if this man can shoot a shot.
Let's go.
All right, there we go.
Jordan, good to see you, man. How you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to ask specifically about framing discovery questions. I know it's something that my group really does struggle with sometimes. Like, how do you frame your questions about discovery to keep it away from talking about your product functionality and like what it does, rather than finding out potentially what it means to them?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's where I'm leaning into problem-based discovery versus product-based discovery, right? So you're saying, am I asking questions that actually expose a problem? Yes or no, right? So it's looking at each one of those and going, it's more of the how are you questions. What would this cause questions? Are you running into questions? Do you notice this question? What happens if you don't questions? Versus with product-based, right? Like, what would be an example of a product-based question that you're asking in discovery? Because there's also a difference between discovery and then like running the demo and the questions that you're asking there. Discovery really should be all about the person you're talking to.
So you're talking about, I guess, being a little bit more organic about your conversation, right? Sort of asking operational things, asking personal things, and staying away from like, do you do X? Do you do Y?
So you can still ask those things, but the framework is, how are you blank so that bad thing isn't happening? That's how you're seeding the problem, right? So how are you getting cards in front of your team so they're not caught off guard when a competitor gets brought up? That's how you make a product question into a problem question, because you're planting the impact of what not being able to do it actually would cause.
Thanks for the great question, Jordan. Hope you have an awesome time with the rest of the conference here. I mean, Katie, I know we're coming up on the time that you've got, but I love that layout of how do you blank so that X bad thing doesn't happen. I love that layout, really tackling. I'm sure if people aren't already doing, you can throw that in your mix. Mm-hmm. Are there other? Maybe I'll actually pull back for this last question. When you think of as a sales leader, collaborating with other counterparts, building competitive strategies. So you got your product marketers, your competitive intelligence people. Are there things that you wish those people knew about what's going on in your head as a sales leader that would allow for better collaboration? Because one of the poll questions that came up, a lot of people were saying that they're pretty middle of the road in terms of how their sales leaders and CI and PMM people collaborate. So are there things that you wish they knew so they could better come alongside you and work together?
Absolutely. They need to know the customer better. They need to know the customer better. Okay. And we've talked about this before. I think you and I have talked about this. Okay. Jacob, how often do you talk to customers, not prospects, customers? How often?
I would say every 3 weeks, being conservative, okay. But at least.
How often does product marketing talk to customers?
So our team's pretty solid in terms of like listening to calls. They're in Gong all the time. They have like some pretty high standards around that stuff, but that's not the same thing. I don't know the answer to that question. I can't speak for them on that.
So that right there is the biggest difference. Oftentimes in product marketing and enablement and competitive insights, no one's talking to the customer, right? You have customers that used to use your competitor. That's who you need to go talk to and understand why they changed. What was the cause of it? What were they looking for? So you get their language, right? We get these battle cards, right? They're like, oh, here's how we're different from the competition. And the only things that are on there is how our websites are different. Talk to the customers. I love that your team is at least listening to calls, but go talk to them, because that's where you're going to learn the most insight about your customers. Because also you could ask a customer, if you got good ones, to go through the demo process with your competitor. There, now you've got the whole demo process right there because one of your customers went through it for you, right? So that's the biggest, is I wish more people revolved around the customer, sales included, right? Because you're talking to customers every 3 weeks. Most salespeople don't. They talk to prospects. They don't talk to customers. That's the gap. So I do have to jump here, Jacob. I'm so sorry to have to go here, but I do have to jump. You know why.
Yeah, congratulations on every good thing that's happening. Katie, you can hop off. I want to say thank you for everybody here. Yeah, man. And how can people connect with you beyond LinkedIn? Other ways that they can link up?
I think podcast, right? Live Better, Sell Better is the podcast. I do have the Patreon group, but it all kind of starts on LinkedIn. So follow me there and we'll be in touch.
That's great. Thanks, Katie.
All right, y'all. Later.
Now, for everyone else that's still here, I mean, I will open up the floor to any questions around the perspective of ICs, obviously for myself being one, and knowing that we've got a lot of really cool data that we've seen at Klue about what's working for sales teams. So if there are questions that you have to that end, go ahead and throw them in either the Q&A or the event chat. I'm cool either way. Other things that you could be doing at this point as well is Gerard Green's session. Fantastic session around cross-functional collaboration. So if that last question really was up your alley, would highly recommend hopping off to that session as well. But what other things are coming to mind for people around competitive selling, and especially as it relates to what's going on from the perspective of an IC? I see one anonymous question coming up. If you want, I'm happy to, pull people on screen as well to have that conversation. But this question that just came up was, do you explicitly acknowledge your competitor in a deal? And the answer, I would say, from my experience and also from what we've seen work for other companies, is absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you don't explicitly acknowledge a competitor in a deal, you are ceding ground to that competitor around two things. One, how they define themselves, and two, how they define the problems that your buyers are looking to solve, right? You don't want to leave the door open for that. So what often I find is a helpful question for this, and usually when I talk to other sellers, the reason that they don't ask this, like who else is in the deal, is because they don't want to seem too probing almost. I get that perspective, but you're not actually helping your buyer optimally if they have to kind of put all the pieces together of comparative evaluation for themselves. So if you want to help them, one thing that I found really chill way to ask this question is, as we're going to walk through product, I want to make sure that I'm highlighting the things that are unique and different from maybe other alternatives that you're looking at, if that'd be helpful. What other alternatives are you taking a look at right now? And then maybe they share that proactively, also what you can do and get permission from them to be able to ask to do really compelling differentiation throughout your demo is say, look, I want to make sure that I'm being most helpful for you as we walk through product. So I know you're looking at X, Y, and Z. Would it help you if I was highlighting where we do things differently than them? Or would you just prefer for me to, close that off, just talk about Klue today or whatever product you sell today? Which would be most helpful for you? And often they'll give you permission to really bang out differentiation as you're going along to do that. So hope that helps. We got another anonymous question. What does good preparation look like pre-discovery call with a prospect? It's a really great question. If your SDRs are as A1 as the Klue SDRs are, they'll often ask what alternatives, that buyer's looking at. So if you know who else they're looking at, you can also do some extra prep, refreshing yourself on the competitive content that your product marketing team has put together on why you're better than that other vendor for this client's use case, right? So understanding the alternatives landscape that they're looking at. Another piece that's really important is just to, and this is like slightly less about the competitive side to things, but also super worthwhile, is just get to familiarize yourself with the other clients maybe that are similar to them that your company served, right? That's going to really resonate as far as like the use cases that you bring up. It'll make it really in their world, and that's where you want to live for as much as possible. So there's lots of other things that you could say, but it's also really useful from a competitive standpoint to know how people in their space have gotten value out of what you're doing that's different than what they could accomplish with another vendor or partner, because you want to make sure that you're differentiating in that way as much as possible implicitly too through customer stories. So hope that helps. What other questions are popping up? All right. I'm not seeing any others. What might be helpful? If you haven't filled out an answer to the polls, by the way, yet, make sure you go ahead and do that. I'm seeing a lot of people describe, though, that their revenue leaders and other competitive strategy leaders get along like pretty middle to below average. So if you got questions about that as well, happy to share what's worked for other people, in terms of improving that alignment. So if you got questions about that, go ahead and throw them in. When SEs, so Emily, would you be comfortable coming on video and asking that question? If so, just go ahead and hit the request to share audio and video that I can bring you on screen. If not, I'm cool to just chill here. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and answer the question then. So when SEs ask if a prospect is looking at competitors and the prospect is unwilling to name the competitors, how would you suggest they talk about competitors in the rest of the call? continue to just generally talk about differentiators. What's a tactful way to go about it? It's a really good question because you're right. They won't always share, but there are some things that your competitive strategy, playmakers, right? Whether it's CI people, product marketers, sales enablement, whoever it is, there are lots of things that they can do to figure out and consolidate and put in front of your SEs or account executives, whoever it is. What are some things to look out for that might suggest X competitor is in a deal, right? Maybe they talk about, they have unique terminology for the way that they describe problems, or certain functionalities that they're asking about that are really common and potentially exclusive to another vendor. Rather than sales reps have to figure all this out for themselves, hopefully you've got a central team that's putting that sort of content together. But how do you spot them? We call them cards on a battle card. How do you spot them card should be really well beloved by sales reps and SEs. So that's one thing I would recommend, is just consult those, get really familiar with those, so that you can kind of, even if you don't call them out explicitly, start to deposition maybe some of those pieces, or start to test that hypothesis of, is this vendor in this deal? Another thing that you can do is remember that the first conversation isn't the last conversation, right? I can understand that, if you ask someone, hey, I'd love to be able to make this, more straightforward for you as you're going through your evaluation process. What other alternatives are you looking at? They don't say anything right away. Maybe that's just because they just met you. Maybe they just need a little time to warm up. And once they've warmed up, maybe in a second conversation or something like that, you can ask them how the evaluation is going again. So don't limit discovery just the first portion of one call. Try and spread throughout. Obviously, with SEs, it can kind of depend. Maybe you only have one shot with them, but hopefully there are other teams that are getting to build extended relationship and can also kind of lean into that, try and uncover some of those pieces as well. Hopefully that was a helpful, straightforward answer. And then do you talk about differentiators? Generally, I think always with the caveat that you're addressing a real problem that they have, right? If you're asking questions in discovery that illuminate what challenges that person really has, then the differentiator that you're speaking to isn't really just about differentiating against other vendors that can't do something. You're talking about something that actually has value to the buyer. And that's always your fail-safe, right? Make sure you're thinking about your demo flows and what you show and how you're asking questions to illuminate those things, so that even if you don't ever end up hearing about who else is in the deal, you're giving unique value to solving a unique problem. Hope that helped, Emily. And if you have follow-ups about that, you can throw that in the chat as well. No worries. If you got other questions, that's all good too. You can hop on camera then. We got another question here. How do you handle situations where a competitor has a better feature or solves a certain problem slightly better? Yeah, so this is a super common question. What happens if they're better than us at something? Well, one thing that can be helpful depending on the context is there are times where you're going to want to say, yeah, they do this thing better. If it's actually just factually, transcendently true, they do this so much better. Saying that they don't, might just seem like you're not keeping it real with the person that you're talking to, and that might break trust. But there are a few things you're going to want to get to before that. And the first thing you're going to want to understand is, does this really matter? We've got a couple of competitors we come up against all the time that are pitching things that just don't affect the day-to-day life of the person that they're talking to, but a demo's pretty, and they want to try and get ahead. So they'll frame that stuff up. And in the, again, interest of keeping it real with the person that's buying from you, come back to those things you were discussing in terms of problems like KD was talking about earlier. What are you really trying to solve for? And if they're really trying to solve for something where that's peripheral, come back to the things that matter most to them. So that's the first thing. If you solve things in a different way, I think this also comes back to whether you're thinking about your pricing model or your business model, like Anthony was talking about in that major keynote, or whether you're talking about, other sorts of functionalities. Remember that the how is something that you can kind of talk around or kind of reframe if you have a different how, as long as the why is getting accomplished. So if they have a certain maybe UX or UI piece that's like different than yours, make sure that you share some of the benefits of yours and come back to the fact that really the job is getting done, and maybe getting done in a different way that could be better for other reasons that may more align with their use case. But at the end of the day, if you've done all that and it still just comes out that they've done better in a certain area, there are times when someone's just better served by another vendor. But also there are times where you're going to want to lay out the whole scope of what matters most to them and show how you delivered on the highest value pieces. And even conceding that, hey, this lesser value thing, they do better, that could actually build trust so that when you lean into the things that are most important, they're more likely to believe you when you say it. So I hope that answers that question. At least that's one person's take, right? But hopefully that's useful. All right. Any other questions or thoughts that are popping up here? Another thing that's seeming to show up in the poll results that y'all were sharing about is we've got a lot of competitive enablers as much as we have, individual contributors on the sales side. So if there are questions that you have around, from the perspective of a competitive enabler that you would want to get inside the head of a sales rep about, here we are. This is shoot your shot. What else is kind of popping up here? I think that might be all. So I'll do a going once, going twice sold sort of moment here. If nothing else is coming up, some other things that you can keep in mind for the rest of your time here today. Again, there is still Gerard's session that I believe is running for another 15 minutes on how do you create cross-functional alignment. So that is definitely a session I could commend to you. Gerard's awesome. He's a good friend. He's built some incredible competitive programs and product marketing programs, and gotten really, I think one of his superpowers is creating that cross-functional alignment. Also, another great friend who's going to come up in the next session is Kyle Coleman. If you're not familiar with Kyle Coleman, he is a prospecting wizard. He's built an incredible SDR team. There's lots of people doing that over at Clary. But, as the leader of that team, I mean, he's just done some incredible best-in-class work you've probably seen on LinkedIn. If you don't follow him on LinkedIn, he might be my favorite LinkedIn follower, one of for sure. And he's going to be talking about prospecting experience as competitive differentiation. So if you haven't heard someone talk about that yet, there could not be a better person for you to hear that from than Kyle. And I'm definitely going to be hopping into that session after this. If there's nothing else, also know that the one-on-one networking sessions in the meet and greet tab, I've personally just gotten a lot out of it in terms of meeting people, hearing what their challenges are, sharing what I've seen that works, and learning a lot, frankly, from what other people have done. So if you haven't done any of those meet and greet networking sessions, go ahead and hop in there. But I think that might be the wind down on the session. So thanks for stopping by. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. If you have any questions, happy to answer. I hope you have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the summit.